Dr. Maynard Kaufman has been living in West Michigan for many years, and I look to him as being an example of someone that I would, I'm very happy to have met Maynard. He set an excellent example with his life, and someone that I'm trying to follow in his footsteps. He received his PhD degree from the University of Chicago Divinity School in 1971. He'd already been teaching at that time in the religion department at Western Michigan University since 1963. In 1970, he gradually was shifting his courses in religion and literature to environmental studies. And he helped develop an interdisciplinary program in environmental studies at Western Michigan University. And starting in 1973, he was able to negotiate a half-time presence at the college, or at the university, where he was working on a 100-acre farm here in the area that he purchased, and kind of set up a school of homesteading. And during the 1970s, he would have 8 to 10 students in residence at the farm for about 8 months at a time, learning various food and farming-related skills. And he continued that program for nearly 30 years. In 1976, he helped organize the Michigan Land Trustees and coordinated a cooperative arrangement between Western Michigan University and in 1973, he also helped organize the Organic Growers of Michigan. In 2001, there was a picture, I don't know if you noticed here, 2001, Maynard with his wife built an off-the-grid home that's been off the grid since 2001. It's a modern home, all the modern conveniences, but it's completely disconnected from the grid. In 2003, he helped organize the first Organic Harvest Festival in Southwest Michigan. In 2008, he published a book entitled Adapting to the End of Oil Toward the Earth-Centered Spirituality. In 2009, he helped organize the Transition Van Buren-Allegan, which has also had some children transition groups, and we now have a transition group that we'll announce later at the end of the program here in South Haven. So, Maynard, come on up. We're really honored to have him as part of our Michigan Safe Energy Future Group.
That's the title of the presentation, and I find myself both cheered up and also saddened a little bit by the presentation by Peter, because what I liked was the last part about the rapid rise of renewable energy, but I'm taking home a warning about the first part. In other words, that this is a very serious thing that we're facing with climate change, and of course the icebergs is only, or the glaciers is only one small part of it. There's so many other things that could have been focused on there. So time is limited. I want to spend time today to share some of my research along a line that's a little different from the one that most people on climate science talk about. And it is rooted, of all places, in my experience as an organic farmer. And you may wonder what this has to do with it, but I'll hope to explain as much as I can. So anyway, it is certainly time that we move in our discussion about climate change from problems to solutions, because so much focus on problems has made us, well, either blasé, yeah, we heard that all before, or it's, for those of us who are really concerned about it, it's made us really agitated and concerned that there is probably no solution, because it's all problems and there's no solution. I think there are, and I think Peter does, and I think that we want to discuss what these possibilities might be. The solution to climate change certainly is to reduce carbon emissions and get the excess carbon out of the air. It is also necessary to replace fossil fuels with renewable energy to curtail emissions of carbon dioxide as much as possible, though even renewable energy takes some carbon dioxide or emits some in its manufacture. At the beginning also, I want to be very clearly understood that nuclear energy, contrary to what some people have argued, is not a carbon-free energy source. In fact, according to one book called The Suicidal Planet, the argument is made that there is fossil fuel energy needed in the entire life cycle of nuclear energy, of the nuclear energy process, from mining uranium to decommissioning the power plant. Nuclear energy, while it emits only a third as much carbon as coal-fired plants, does emit 3 to 4 times more carbon dioxide than the same amount of power generated in wind turbines. And this is probably one of the big solutions. We have only 2 very, very small ones compared to this. See the car at the bottom. But wind is much, much more common than it used to be, because as the air warms, there's more wind. In order to phase out fossil fuels, we do also need policies such as a tax on carbon that would curtail the burning of fossil fuels, which causes so much of that global warming. Even this is daunting at a time when large energy corporations seem to control the governing bodies in our country. But much carbon dioxide, as much as a third more, or more of the total, also escaped from the soil because of deforestation and agricultural practices. Can this carbon dioxide be sequestered back into soil and plants? This is the question that we shall explore here. It is possible, I'm saying, to sequester carbon in natural and ways that are beneficial to life on the planet. Once we understand this, we can move from hopelessness to hopefulness. This is especially true if many of us can actually participate in solutions to global warming. Planting trees would be an illustration of that. Rising prices for energy and food are also already pressuring social changes as new attitudes about raising food emerge. Unused land in many cities opens possibilities for urban gardening, and rising unemployment opens the need and the time to do so. Also evident is a new interest in the Back to the Land movement, with which I was associated in the 70s. And this, of course, also is motivated by rising food prices, as well as the desire that people have for better quality food than you can buy from the industrial food system. Anyway, in view of such trends, this paper hopes to disagree with the many writers about climate change who simply assume business as usual will continue until it's too late. I don't think that's the case. So it will be helpful as we look at ways to sequester carbon to have a clear understanding of how it is emitted. And the burning of fossil fuels is already mentioned, but it is certainly a major factor. But deforestation is also recognized as a cause of global warming, along with agricultural practices such as plowing, in other words, land use and agriculture. And these amounts are much more difficult to quantify, and as a result, they tend to be overlooked by scientists who like firm statistics for what they're talking about. And of course, that would be a serious problem if it were overlooked, because there are some real possibilities, I'm convinced, here that could be done. Carbon exists in the soil as organic matter. And when tillage exposes it to open air, it oxidizes and escapes as carbon dioxide. Plowing is the commonest form of oxidation through tillage because it inverts the soil so that what is underneath loses its carbon. The pioneers plowed the prairie of perennial grasses to plant the annual grasses that we know as corn and wheat. These are great for food production, but because they put their energy into seed rather than roots, but they're not very good for sequestering carbon, as in fact the roots do of plants. So, we speak of this process as the loss of topsoil, in other words, erosion, oxidation, and so on. But it is also, of course, the loss of carbon from the soil. This early agricultural regime was clearly not sustainable, and it soon had to be subsidized with chemical fertilizers, especially for nitrogen. This was made available after World War II with anhydrous ammonia, after it was no longer used to manufacture explosives. Fertility in the soil that was lost through bad agricultural practices was now replaced with chemical fertilizers. These could make plants grow, but they also destroyed much of the biological life that had earlier liberated nutrients for plants. And this is a recurrent theme in what I'm saying. The microorganisms in the soil have made plants grow and liberated the nutrients in the soil that they needed. When they were destroyed by chemical fertilizers and pesticides and fungicides and herbicides, because there's a long list of killers here, all left over from World War II. The soil lost its ability to produce crops, and of course this then became a treadmill of addiction in which more and more fertilizers had to be pumped into the chemical fertilizers into the soil to keep it productive. These pests, of course, these plants that chemical fertilizers made grow were also much more vulnerable to insect pests and diseases, and as a result, more herbicides and more of everything else had to be put on the soil. Carbon is naturally sequestered in the process of photosynthesis, as sunshine uses carbon dioxide in the air to make plants grow and provides carbohydrates and sugars and oxygen in the process. As the plants decompose, their organic matter is worked into the soil. Some carbon is also sequestered. But this requires a living soil in which the soil microorganisms and larger organisms, such as earthworms, have not been damaged by chemicals. Now, most of the details of this are things I've learned through my lifetime as an organic farmer for many years, but also as I try to reflect on these as a prof in environmental studies and try to figure out what I was doing on the farm, because I wasn't always sure. The emphasis on organic matter in the soil, that is carbon, and its loss after hundreds of years of plowing has been reviewed by many authors. Other soil scientists, such as Ratan Lal at Ohio State University, explain that carbon can be replaced in soils. Lal found that with better carbon management practices, soils in the continental United States could soak up 330 million tons of carbon each year, more than the emissions from cars, and improve the food production by 12%. But some of this requires a shift to no-till organic farming in which the microorganisms in the soil can thrive. So a paradigm shift to organic methods of farming is needed in agricultural science. But although the United States Department of Agriculture tolerates organic farming and regulates organic produce, neither it nor the state agricultural schools and their extension services have given up the chemical paradigm of conventional agriculture. Given the political power of agro-industrial corporations, this is not likely to happen soon, but it is beginning. Michigan State University scientists at the long-term ecological research site at the Kellogg Biological Station near Hickory Corners have found that conventional row crop farming emitted about as much carbon dioxide as organic row crop farming sequestered. So on the one hand, chemical farming causes or adds to the problem. Organic farming helps to solve it, but unmanaged ecosystems, which they're also watching closely in their long-term ecological project, on abandoned farmland that are in the early stages of succession toward trees, sequestered about 4 times as much carbon dioxide than organic farming methods. Trees certainly help in carbon sequestration. The best agriculture in any region is the one that best mimics the region's natural ecosystems. In the eastern part of the United States, this would be forests of various kinds. And my local conservation district, in urging people in the county to plant more trees, claimed that an acre of trees removes 2.6 tons of carbon dioxide each year from the air. Of course, that depends on the size of the trees. I think if you're just planting them, it isn't that much. These trees can be food producing also, as J. Russell Smith argued in his important book of 1929, Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture. Smith's book was largely ignored for nearly 50 years until his argument was resurrected in new ways by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren as permaculture. Permaculture generally emphasizes perennial crops and the revitalization of life in the soil by building organic matter. The new argument for tree crops is emerging in the same context, in the context of a changing climate. As they replace energy-intensive annual food crops, tree crops, with their deeper roots and deeper roots can withstand droughts and violent rainstorms, which would otherwise cause loss of organic matter from soil. They can slow the process of climate change as they store more carbon and thrive with virtually no tillage. In the longer term, when tree crops mature, their carbon can be stored in lumber, and the residue can be burned with limited oxygen, pyrolysis, and turned into charcoal, or so-called biochar, and worked into the soil for permanent sequestration. I have still patches of dark soil on my farm where fruit trees were gathered and burned years ago, and these patches still remain more fertile. As Albert Bates emphasized in his book, The Biochar Solution, biochar can be made of any organic matter, but wood is often used because it's so easily available. Albert Bates also, as a proponent of biochar, a strong one, is evaluating several small stoves that have been developed to make biochar. Carbon sequestration in biochar or in tree crops or in the soil is largely ignored by scientists who seem to seek one total technological solution to climate change. This is easily seen by Googling carbon sequestration. Many large-scale, expensive, and risky geoengineering projects have been proposed. They are reviewed in books like Fixing the Climate by James Roger Fleming or Earth Masters by Clive Hamilton. Both review some very large-scale, expensive, and risky geoengineering proposals to fix the climate. And this is something with which we should look at with a lot of caution. We should worry that maybe some of their proposals will be tried if the many small-scale and natural possibilities that could sequester carbon are not put into practice. In other words, they're looking for a technical or a mechanical solution to the carbon in the atmosphere, and they're wondering how can we isolate it and then put it deep underground or into the oceans. And they're so fixated, in this sense, on technological solutions that they seem to have forgotten photosynthesis, which actually does exactly what these geoengineering scientists want to do. So, unfortunately then, these sequestration strategies that are beneficial, safe, and natural have been ignored by most conventional scientists because they might not do the job by themselves. But as they reduce emissions and slow global warming, they provide the time needed to phase out fossil fuels. We must insist that better farming methods and more tree crops should be promoted to sequester carbon dioxide in ways that do not simultaneously improve the soil. Soils can be made more productive even as they sequester carbon in humus. This is done by building up organic matter in the soil. More productive soils will be needed in a future with more mouths to feed under the constraints of global warming. And I might add the end of cheap oil as well. A new book by Kristen Olson asserts this in its title, "The Soil Will Save Us." The author reviews many of the initiatives and experiments in which farmers especially are building organic matter by feeding soil microorganisms. Above all, we need to be open to the social changes that are serendipitously pressured by higher energy prices and thus reduced carbon emissions. More local food, more small farms and homesteads, as fossil fuels, big farms become less economical, more people active in transition towns, more tree planting, etc. Here it is the people who will make the changes that are necessary, but they should be helped with appropriate governmental policies and assistance. Now, there are two issues that are ignored by nearly all the popular books on climate change, if they even mention carbon sequestration, and some do not. The first is that better farming methods such as growing crops with non-chemical organic methods and without tillage are already being practiced. They emerged as farmers and ranchers tried to restore soil fertility. For some of these, the issue of reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was secondary. That is, their primary concern was improving their soil. Such methods should have the support of agricultural bureaucracies, along with a more complete reformation of farming methods that can restore climate from the atmosphere to the soil. But I have come to realize that organic farming is a very specialized topic that is unfamiliar to nearly all scientists. Moreover, the focus on technology among mainstream so-called scientific thinkers has apparently blinded them to the power of biological processes. But it is possible to work with nature rather than simply try to control nature. The second issue, also ignored by general writers on climate change, as well as conventional agricultural scientists, is the fact that carbon dioxide is not simply a pollutant to get rid of, but a much needed resource for soil improvement. This is recognized by the so-called carbon farmers. You can see their website, Carbon Farmers of America, who affirm that it is possible to do both, sequester carbon in the soil and thereby improve the soil. These two streams of thought are now merging into one. This both and emphasis is articulated in a new article by Adam Sachs and colleagues, which argues that it is possible to reduce atmospheric carbon dioxide to pre-industrial levels. This article, which is being published in a book called Geotherapy, generally supports my thinking in this paper with a more scientific basis. So once again, where does the carbon in the atmosphere come from? The conventional answer is that 2/3 comes from burning fossil fuels. More recently, an increasing number of analysts have argued that as much as half has come from deforestation and plowing the land, which oxidizes the organic matter in the soil. And of course, depending on how far back you go, you'd, can we skip that and go ahead?
Yep.
Yeah, here we are. This chart, this graph, I think, shows two different ways of looking at the impact of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The first is the modern way, starting with 1700, that's the industrial way. And then the second one goes back 8,000 years and shows that, in fact, this has been an ongoing problem for a long time, but it wasn't noticed because it was so minimal. But now it is. And as it is, we need to then look at ways of getting it back into the soil. And that's what what I'm trying to do here today. This I owe it to this graph to William Ruderman in his book Plows, Plagues and Petroleum, who looks at other factors than petroleum when he thinks about carbon dioxide. According to Australian soil scientist Christine Jones, 50 to 80% of the carbon has been lost from the soil. She has a wonderful website too called Amazing Carbon. The top 3 feet of soil is said to contain nearly 2,400 gigatons of carbon. That's 1 billion metric tons, which is about 3 times more than what is in the atmosphere. Since this, so if over half the soil carbon has been lost, the soil can easily accommodate at least twice as much as still remains in it. Percentages of organic matter in soils now down to 1 to 2% should be at least twice as much. Undisturbed prairie soils can contain 10 to 20% of organic matter. In fact, carbon constantly moves between air and soil and water. And that's what this diagram tends to illustrate. No, don't worry about the numbers on it because it's a different numbering system than I'm using. But basically, it's a natural thing for carbon to move out of the soil, back into the soil, and of course into the oceans, which incidentally are also a carbon sink, and one that is getting more and more, the oceans are getting more and more acidic as a result of absorbing too much carbon. Soils that are rich in organic matter and humus provide a habitat for microbial life that can feed the plants growing on it. It is this lack of organic matter that has made chemical fertilizers an easy substitute. But chemical fertilizers, according to soil scientists such as Christine Jones in Australia or Elaine Ingham in this country, argue that chemical fertilizers actually disrupt and destroy organic matter and humus in the soil. And they are therefore addictive, because that means there need to be more chemical fertilizers, which are going to be in shorter supply and more costly. And of course, chemical fertilizers continue to emit rather than sequester carbon dioxide. They not only result in serious surface and groundwater pollution, some also emit nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas. At best, chemical fertilizers are a temporary technological fix. Now, as we think ahead to a time when fossil fuels, as well as the minerals used to make fertilizers, are likely to be increasingly expensive, if available for use at all in agriculture, it will be necessary to restore organic matter, which is 58% carbon, in the soil. A variety of methods has been proposed to accomplish this, and some are suitable for large-scale farms and ranches. These include no-till, and this graph shows the loss of organic matter in soil under plowing, and then gradually, as farmers started using no-till agriculture, which is pretty common now, there's been less, or at least the loss of CO2 is rising. Not much, but a little bit, 61% as compared to 53% earlier on. among the methods used, and each of these could be a talk in itself, of course, is grazing ruminants like cattle, sheep or goats, in rotational grazing patterns as specified by Alan Savory in his holistic management program. And that is essentially to move them frequently, maybe sometimes even every day, in close paddocks so that their hooves will break down the organic matter in the leaves and press them into the ground. And this can save or put more carbon into the soil, according to Savory, and I think especially the people who are using it, and there are many doing that. There's another way which is using deep subsoiling with like a chisel plow, especially the yeoman's chisel plow, which avoids, another is to avoid chemicals for pest control and chemical fertilizer, which I've already mentioned. Still another might be to do what's called pasture cropping, in which annual grains are grown in dormant perennial grasses, and this keeps the system feeding microorganisms on a more or less year-round basis. Still other strategies, such as burning organic materials in the absence of oxygen, that I mentioned earlier, to form biochar and spreading it on the soil, returning composted manure to the soil, and gradually substituting perennial for annual food plants where possible can be useful in larger or smaller operations. A fellow named Brian Rumsey reviewed the relevance of perennial food crops under development at the Land Institute in Kansas to climate change in the summer issue of the Land Report, and found that perennial crops best mimic the productivity of the native prairie. I think you can see on the right, the roots of wheat essentially, and drill about 4 or 5 inches apart. And here on the left is the perennial plants. These roots, of course, will sequester a great deal of carbon, as well as keep the plant going year after year. Soil carbon scientists agree with older organic theorists, such as Sir Albert Howard, that plants thrive best in association with mycorrhizal fungi that not only deliver nutrients to plants, grasses and trees, but also help to build soil structure and the aggregation of soil particles in the humification process. And all this is helped by cover crops that grow as much as possible on a year-round basis and provide fuel for soil microbes. The emphasis, of course, is on the living soil that should not be disturbed with chemical fertilizers and pesticides, including fungicides. Now, not everybody agrees with this theory about putting or building up organic matter in the soil as a way of sequestering carbon. And some see soil as sort of an inert medium in which the plant is nourished by the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that is applied to the soil. That's maybe a kind of a negative way of seeing conventional agricultural science. Put plant in the soil, let the soil prop it up so that it collects sunlight, and that's all you need to do. But in fact, there's much more to it. There's a whole other theory, in fact, that is competing with this chemical paradigm, and that's the organic paradigm. In fact, I think in one of the very first organic meetings I ever attended, I heard the farmers muttering to each other, "Feed the soil, not the plant." Which means that in order to make plants grow, you help those microorganisms liberate the nutrients for them. And some of the big names in agricultural science, like Raton Lal, whom I mentioned earlier, professor of soil science at The Ohio State University. Also, although he sees great possibilities in carbon sequestration, he says that at the rate of 1%, if soil organic carbon in degraded soils was sequestered at the rate of 0.1% per year, it would lead to a sequestration of 300 million metric tons of carbon a year, equal to the net annual increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. We've seen several of these that I've read from soil scientists, predictions of what could happen. This fellow, though, says this might happen only about in the next 50 years, which might not be long enough. But others disagree with that and say it can be much quicker. And in fact, Alan Yeomans, who wrote a big book about sequestering carbon in the soils, says it could be done in 10 years. But he also said other things that are, in my judgment, unfortunate, such as half the book is devoted to nuclear power as a solution to the whole business of climate change. Anyway, Lau and his colleagues write like fairly conventional agricultural scientists and largely ignore the role of soil microorganisms in plant nutrition or carbon sequestration. I would suggest that they probably seek acceptance by fellow agricultural scientists because they write like that. The word humification, for example, is defined but very seldom used in their recommendations. They focus on conservation, tillage, and careful incorporation of crop residues in soils. So, if reformed food production techniques make it possible to take carbon dioxide from the air and fix it in the soil, and thereby also make the soil more productive, it may be that the nightmare of global warming will be delayed, thus providing more time to make the changes needed to reduce its more extreme impacts. But the lure of money seems to deter many of us from thinking about a sustainable way of life, so we also need a shift in values. One really such fundamental and necessary shift is to convince government leaders to move beyond their obsession with economic growth in the money economy as they continue to promote the production and burning of fossil fuels. How can we learn to recognize the illusory nature of money in compared to the gifts of nature? And how can we give up the dream of material progress and instead seek contentment in learning how to work with nature rather than to transform nature with technology? And how can we gear into the coming post-petroleum era, which opens opportunities for more people to be involved in food production and participate in the planting of brand new trees and plants? These questions, of course, relate to the main concern in this paper, planning for a future in which the use of fossil fuels will be severely constrained. These fuels make climate change worse. They are already expensive, and impending shortages will make them more expensive. A shift to organic agriculture is necessary rather than continued dependence on petrochemicals which add carbon dioxide to the air rather than to the soil. Although too much carbon dioxide could be buried in the atmosphere is a pollutant, carbon is a valuable resource in the soil. So even if carbon dioxide could be buried deep in the earth or under the oceans, as geoengineers propose, as much as possible should first be incorporated into the soil to build up organic matter. Organic matter provides the nutrients that make plants grow, develops soil structure that can withstand extreme weather by absorbing more water in heavy rains and holding that moisture in dry periods. And because it is 58% carbon, it adds carbon to the soil. The humification process, which converts that carbon into living and productive soil, makes sure it remains there. Above all, we will need more naturally productive soils to provide enough food with less dependence on petrochemical inputs.
agenda is that for the next 15 minutes, we'll have questions and discussion for Maynard. And then we'll move to a session or a time period where it's a wrap-up discussion with both speakers. So for the next 15 minutes, Maynard will field questions and discussion about his talk.
Did you say that if ground is left fallow and goes into the succession stages, that it's 4 times more efficient at sequestering carbon as organic?
That's what they found at the long-term ecological project.
So if
humans disappear,
that's a solution. If humans disappear, within 150, 200 years, we got a nice green planet again.
that's price to pay.
Okay.
So, with permaculture, which, if my understanding is correct, and you planting the perennials and trees and stuff, that's more likely than organic farming to sequester carbon, because you aren't disturbing the soils once you have the stuff planted.
And permaculture is a word that's kind of got a cultic appeal for a lot of people.
I like it.
And it's good, but I don't think it's essentially very different from organic farming when it's done properly. In other words, even organic farming will need to be reforming its methods because it too has depended on tillage.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Well, I grew up on a 5-generation farm. And my father's like 84 years old, but he's got the farm now, he owns a lot of land, he's selling it off and whatnot, 5-acre garden. He's still doing the farm market thing, he's actually working the garden, but he's gonna plow this, he's gonna plant, and now he's really go after the weeds. Now, I would tell him, he really should be doing like borehole farming. You should be, but it's, you can't get them. First of all, I don't know nothing about farming anyway.
But when we get to be 80, 85 years old,
Yeah.
we get pretty set in our ways.
Bring him around, but trying to bring him around to maybe borehole farming, maybe if he wasn't plowing and disking the soil, that's where all the weeds come from. Just let it grow over to a grass, and just bore into that, the nylon around, you wouldn't have the huge weed problem, right?
And even mowing the grass is very good because grasses always want to kind of find a balance between roots and shoots, new shoots. And so therefore the roots, when you cut the top a little bit, the roots also diminish a little bit to compensate. And that's where the carbon then sequesters.
Because I went out this time of year and his garden is just all weeds now.
Yeah, so is mine.
Because he can't keep up, he can't keep the labor.
Right.
Nothing for a way around that.
What's an example of a perennial crop?
Chestnuts,
Pardon?
Chinese chestnuts.
Chinese chestnut's a tree. Yeah, any tree.
But are there perennial crops that are not trees?
Yeah, there are some.
Jerusalem
In fact,
artichokes.
one of the permaculture guys who is a proponent of that way of thinking has recently published a little book called Perennial Vegetables. And I read it, but I didn't find a lot of useful information because many of them aren't appropriate here. But I did get started some onions, which are multiplier onions. You know, that's a very common thing. And they are perennial vegetables.
Jerusalem artichokes.
Thank you. Any others?
Apples.
Well, yeah, trees, but I mean, how about plants and not trees?
Would asparagus?
That's a good word. Yeah.
Rhubarb.
Rhubarb is another one, sure.
Potatoes are, I throw them out, they come right up.
Potatoes, they'll grow right in your compost.
Isn't there
Also,
also,
perennial that's been
A
developed.
perennial wheat is being developed at the Land Institute called Kernza. And it's been taken up by some agricultural schools. as well, and they're starting to promote it and develop it further and so on. So this is the Land Institute in Kansas is a very notable place for what it's doing to help us move into perennial grasses. So
I'm trying to remember whether amaranth is a perennial.
I don't think it is. If it's pigweed, that amaranth.
Easy to reseed, but it's easy to reseed it, but it is an annual.
Is there any way that you can grow annual vegetables and still help the soil sequester more carbon? That would make healthier plants.
Oh, sure. And the best way probably for the ordinary household is a heavy mulching with, some hay or straw instead of tilling the soil to control the weeds. And it would add organic matter as it breaks down, keep the weeds down, conserve the moisture. So mulching would be good.
There's a great movie that's available for free online called Back to Eden that details the process of using mulch. He likes wood chips, but as you say, hay and straw also is good. But that movie is available online, Back to Eden film, free.
Yeah, and the mulch should be something that disintegrates fairly easy and rots into the soil.
Leaves.
Yeah, whatever covers the ground cover. Don't like bare earth.
Yeah, leaves are not desirable, however, because in the process of rotting, they take a lot of nitrogen, and so they, in a sense, diminish the fertility of the soil, too, at least temporarily.
I thought I heard statistics that you were saying, comparing the way that we're farming now with a lot of chemicals to a more organic that you're proposing. You're going from being a carbon emitter almost to a carbon sequesterer about at the magnitude of our transportation industry.
Yeah, it's a possibility. But to get agricultural leaders to endorse that is a whole other thing, as with any of these schemes. So in other words, what's technically possible isn't necessarily socially acceptable, always.
From a financial standpoint, or from, what's the trade-off? If you have an organic method of farming, is it as productive as the current
It can be.
per acre?
One of the leading organic institutes in the country is the Rodale Institute. And they've been doing experiments for a long time showing that they can produce yields that are equal.
So equal productivity without the input of the chemical and the petroleum products, which is better for the soil and obviously the whole petrochemical industry would not like that because there must be some profit in it for them that they wouldn't be getting.
So there's a lot of hindrances to that, and they're usually economic.
I was just going to say that it really relates to institutions. And you have land-grant institutions that have dedicated funding, and you have specialized people in their own little niche, and they pursue that with funding. And so it's very hard to get the institutions to change, just like it's hard to bring change in schools, because you have institutions and you have all sorts of institutional problems and structural problems. So you've had these very innovative people like Rodale who had this brilliant idea of doing comparisons, although in Europe, in Wageningen, they've been doing it for over 100 years.
Right.
And the living soils are much more absorbent of rainwater up to a point than conventional, industrial ag soils. Are also more resistant to drought. So the soil is living, and it can, within tolerance levels, it will accept much more variability in weather and perhaps climate to
It's
some
more
degree.
resilient, to use
Yeah,
the
more
popular
resilient.
word nowadays.
Is there a point in the life cycle of a forest where sequestration, carbon sequestration is more intense than at other points? In other words, would a climax oak-breathing forest sequester more carbon than the intermediate species that might preclude or be,
As they mature, they will naturally slow down the sequestration process. But they do continue to grow, and as they do, they sequester it. But when the trees die and rot, you lose all that.
Right, so
That's
so
when
in
you have to-
managing forests, as humans are wont to do,
Yeah.
we wanted, at what point in the cycle of a forest would we want to optimize?
Well, just before they die. Because until then, they're still good.
Get those things out of there and plant more.
I don't know, but I neglected to include reference to another text that was prepared to help us when we switch to a carbon offset cap and trade system, if we ever do. And that's a book that tells you exactly how to measure very carefully the carbon that's growing in trees or in grasses or in whatever. So, and many people go for grasses more than anything else, and maybe for some very good reasons. Because while the wood itself in the trees contains the carbon, in grasses they facilitate the carbon sequestration in the soil itself, which is really the best place to put it permanently. And of course, if you remember the diagram of the global carbon cycle, none of these are permanent. They're always moving one to the other. But we hope to retain more of it. That's the whole idea. And it's possible to do that.
What percent of seed available is not under the thumb of Monsanto?
Well, there are some. I don't know how much there'd be for. Well, there is corn seed available, but the problem is planting corn in a farming neighborhood because it's the seeds that are protected by Monsanto, as in canola in Canada and so on, are going to. Well, they pollinate, and then the Monsanto people claim lots of fields that weren't even planted. But mostly for garden crops, I think you can do just about anything you want.
Well, on the radio this morning, there was something about GMO crops that, I mean, it was just something experimental, and now in Oregon and other places it's showing up, like it just, what do you do about that?
I don't know how the pollen got there, and I don't know if they know, but maybe somebody decided to sabotage either the farmer or Monsanto by starting to spread these seeds around. I don't know.
I mean, things like that, will interfere, and who's Secretary of Agriculture that Obama appointed? If we want to look at government and what government's doing, it's a Monsanto guy. How could he do that? Money.
There's a lot of those structural things that here that we have to fight.
So we're going to field one more question from the audience, and it looks like
This isn't really a question, and it's just sort of where do you get your seeds? There are places that have organic seeds that are heritage or not under Monsanto's thumb. I mean, there's Johnny's Seeds and
Bountiful Gardens.
all sorts of places. You don't have to buy
A
it.
lot of the vegetables on the table there came from seed savers
Seed savers.
in Iowa.
Right.
Sort of,
So as the moderator, I'd like to end Maynard's question and discussion time with the same question that I asked Peter, and that is, as a person, how can I personally, can I slow climate change down? And what would your recommendation be for a single person? What's the most effective thing they could do to help slow climate change down?
Well, for a single family, I guess I would say, a house dependent on renewable energy, because that's a good share of it, not all of it. And then the second part would be, if you're going to drive a car, enhance the renewable energy production with more panels or whatever, they're cheap now, to be able to provide energy for an electric car, especially a plug-in.
Thank you, Maynard.
Yeah.